Hello, and thanks for joining me. This video is part of my ongoing series on the argument from evil. The entire series can be found in the Argument from Evil playlist on my channel. For reference, the argument itself is stated in the description below. Today, we're going to consider what is probably the most common defense among Christian apologists, especially amateur apologists.
The fact that there is free will upon the earth. That God gave us free will.
But what people don't understand is, one, God gave you free will.
Mankind has his free will, and the only way God could have prevented evil is by not giving us free will.
My dear unbelieving friend, would you have preferred that God made Adam and Eve without choice? Would you prefer that we didn't have free will?
The gist is that God has given us free will, and that this is a good that justifies God permitting E1 and E2, the two specific evils which are defined in the argument, even when it turns out that the price of free will is that people will inevitably choose to cause suffering with it. Now, there's an obvious response to the free will theodicy, but I'm going to put it off until later. Let's first look at the question of whether free will is even possible, let alone desirable, if God actually exists. The free will defense does presume the truth of libertarian free will among humans. That is, the sort of free will where the state of affairs prior to my decision to do X does not in any way determine that I make that decision. For instance, if I decide to make a video about the free will theodicy, then this was a free will decision if and only if I could have chosen not to make that video, even with the exact state of affairs in the universe obtaining, including my own beliefs and desires being what they were in the instant before I made that decision. Libertarian free will is controversial as it is, and the concept of God makes it even worse. If God exists, and he has knowledge of anything and everything that I have ever done and will ever do, and this seems to be entailed by the combination of God's omniscience and the Christian's view toward prophecy, then assuming God's knowledge is infallible, I had no choice but to make this video. If God knows that I'm going to make the video, and if God is infallible, then it is not possible for me to not make the video. It may seem to me that it's possible, but that's an illusion. It is not possible. In this sense, I do not have libertarian free will if God exists. Now, there's a common response to the incompatibility argument, one which is perhaps best explained by a thought experiment given to me by a Christian, I wish I could remember their name so I could credit them, a number of years ago. Imagine you read in your history books that John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Abraham Lincoln at 10:15 p.m. on April 14, 1865. You then get in your time machine, because it's a thought experiment, why wouldn't you have a time machine? Go back in time to the night of April 14, 1865, sit in the audience at Ford's Theater, and watch Booth shoot Lincoln at 10:15 p.m. Even though you knew perfectly well what was going to happen, the Christian told me, John Wilkes Booth was still the person responsible, not you, and not the hand of fate. Booth was culpable for the murder. Thus, free will and foreknowledge of your free will actions can coexist. This seems like a plausible response on the face of it, but let's take it a step further. Suppose the following happens. You read about Lincoln's assassination, travel back to 1865, sit in the audience, watch as Booth steps up behind Lincoln, raises the gun to his head, and then pauses, lowers the gun, and walks out. Lincoln, at least for the moment, survives. How is this possible? Well, being a science fiction buff, I am comfortable with the idea that the act of time travel may create a new branching timeline. A new history in which Booth has to make the free will decision to shoot Lincoln all over again. And perhaps in this new history he chooses differently. But if you are not comfortable with that idea, just look at it in terms of a JFK-type conspiracy.
Booth was framed, man.
Either way, if you want to insist that the situation I've just described is not possible, and please no remarks about time travel being impossible here, you know what I mean, then John Wilkes Booth did not have free will to not shoot Lincoln, because free will means it is possible for Booth not to shoot Lincoln, and therefore possible for you to witness Booth not shooting Lincoln. Whereas, if the situation I have described is possible, then you did not have perfect foreknowledge of what Booth was going to do. Either way, the analogy does not show that omniscience and free will can coexist. There is another idea that tries to rescue the compatibility of omniscience and free will, the idea of retrocausation, or backward causation, or, as Christopher Nolan put it, I think it's a good movie, okay? Deal with it. The idea is that our choices are unconstrained in the sense that it is possible that Booth will shoot Lincoln and possible that he won't, but information about what choices we make flows backward in time and causes God to have the knowledge of what our choices will be. Thus, free will and omniscience can coexist. But this is just like the time travel analogy. The only difference is, instead of a person going back in time, information is going back in time. And so, a similar objection to the time travel analogy can be raised here. Does the effect of God's knowing that Booth will shoot Lincoln take place in the same timeline as the cause of Booth shooting Lincoln? That is, if the effect happens, is it inevitable that the cause will also happen in the same timeline? If so, then Booth is constrained to shoot Lincoln in the same sense that we have just stipulated he is unconstrained. There is no possibility that he will not shoot Lincoln, so the backward causation defense is incoherent. On the other hand, if the effect of God's knowledge does not take place in the same timeline as the cause of Booth shooting Lincoln, then it is possible that Booth will not shoot Lincoln, which means God does not have perfect knowledge of Booth shooting Lincoln. One thing before we go on. So far, I have assumed a view called Incompatibilism, which, as the name suggests, is the view that free will and determinism are incompatible with each other. There is another view called, appropriately, Compatibilism, which defines free will in such a way that it is possible to make free choices even in a deterministic universe, and for us to be culpable for those choices. The reason I have assumed incompatibilism is that if compatibilism is true, if it is possible to determine a world in which everyone acts freely, then it seems possible to determine a world in which a certain man freely chooses not to rape, beat, and murder his girlfriend's daughter. Which means that free will is in no way incompatible with God preventing a situation like E2, which means that the free will theodicy fails to explain why E2 happens. Let's turn to another problem with the free will defense as it applies to moral evils such as E2, the rape, beating, and murder of the 5-year-old girl. When we speak of a suffering-causing action being justified by a situation, we typically, if not invariably, hold the action to be justified only if the situation justifying it involves some good coming to the person who experienced the suffering. Otherwise, the situation is one of exploitation, and it's difficult if not impossible to see how an exploitative situation can be moral justification for anything. Again, I'm a science fiction buff, so for me the definitive text here is Ursula K. Le Guin's short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. The story depicts a utopia, a perfect society in which no one wants for anything and all physical, emotional, and even spiritual needs are fulfilled, but at the price of keeping a single child in absolute misery and squalor. The story ends by describing how some of the people in this perfect heavenly place choose to walk away because they rightly see the situation as unjust. Our moral intuitions tell us that no matter how much good comes from exploiting this one child, the exploitation is not justified. So the question is, of what benefit to the 5-year-old girl was her killer's free will? How did it benefit the girl specifically to permit her mother's boyfriend to rape her, beat her, and strangle her to death? What was so great for the girl about the killer's free will and the unrestricted exercise of that free will, at least in the absence of any human intervention, that it was worth her suffering and death? I can think of no satisfactory answer to this question. Now let's finally turn to the obvious problem with the free will defense, that it doesn't seem to account for natural evils. Up to now, we've considered the free will defense as it applies to E2, the case of the 5-year-old girl, but in the case of E1, where lightning caused the fire that caused the agony of the fawn, surely no human free will was involved. Now, one crude response to this problem is to appeal to the activities of Satan and his minions. I say crude, but the fact is that some Christian philosophers who really ought to know better, such as Craig and Plantinga, do seriously put forth the Satan hypothesis as a response to the natural evils problem. even as other Christians bemoan this retreat into the more backward, superstitious aspects of Christian theology. So already, right out the gate, there's a very high intellectual price tag for this response. Here are a few other problems. First, there is no independent evidence for the existence of demonic supernatural beings. So far, we've considered the relatively simple hypothesis of a God who is all-knowing, all-loving, etc. But if we add the additional element of Satan and his minions, and all that entails, we make the hypothesis more complex and decrease its prior probability. Second, science gives us an understanding of many, if not most, natural evils, such that they can be explained in physical terms, leaving no apparent room in which a demon could do his work. Plantinga has suggested that some natural evils are the result of natural forces, while others are the work of Satan, but this doesn't help in terms of rescuing the free will defense from the problem of natural evils. Also, it's basically just a God of the gaps argument, reworked as a Satan of the gaps argument, and just as unconvincing. Third, the same objections to the free will argument as applied to moral evils apply here. It is not at all clear that the benefits of allowing Satan to bring about E1 outweigh the benefits of God preventing E1. Why should this be the case? What is so important about Satan's free will that permitting it is worth allowing the fawn to experience such agony? There's nothing logically impossible about the Satan defense, but that doesn't matter because this is not a logical argument. This is an evidential argument which relies on induction, and if the God hypothesis is ridiculous, then you're not going to rescue it by appealing to the even more ridiculous. Other than the Satan defense, there is one sophisticated defense of the free will theodicy that bears mentioning, that of apologist Richard Swinburne. Swinburne suggests that natural evil is necessary in order to educate humans about what evil is. He argues that in order to make the free will decision to bring about a state of affairs, it is necessary to know how to do it. You can't finish a homework assignment without learning the relevant material, for instance. A person needs to know the consequences of his actions in order to perform it, and the only way he can know about evil consequences is if they happen all the time. Only with this knowledge can we truly have free will, and only through natural evils can we have this knowledge. One trouble with this argument is that, of course, there are other ways for God to give us this knowledge that don't involve natural evils. He could implant the knowledge directly into our minds at birth, the same way we are born with other instinctual knowledge. He could tell us verbally. He could send angels to tell us. He could give us visions of such evils. He could populate the earth with oracles who could tell us the consequences of our evil actions. And he could tell us in any number of ways that are not supernatural. Swinburne complains that coming to know about evil consequences in this way isn't as good as via natural evil because it isn't as certain. Proximity, he states, gives more certain knowledge. Even if we grant this, however, and I don't grant this, it doesn't follow that the knowledge we obtain from other sources wouldn't be good enough. Moreover, once again, we have a problem with justification. As Eleonore Stump has pointed out, it is not at all clear that Swinburne's defense sets up the necessary state of affairs called for in premise P. Quoting from Stump, "If you conceal traps in my front yard, then my repeated attempts to get from my front door to my car parked at the curb will produce in me knowledge about the consequences of my movements. And this knowledge will be useful to me, if I live long enough to acquire it. So this knowledge is good, and it is gained from the experience of evil which you have introduced into my yard. But you are not morally justified in setting traps in my front yard, no matter how good or useful the knowledge of my actions may be, and no matter how dependent that knowledge is on experiencing the jaws of the trap." End quote. Similarly, the existence of leukemia does educate humans about certain types of evils, but nobody is justified in giving cancer to children just so someone can have that knowledge. The Christian might retort that since God created us, he is justified in doing whatever he wants with us, but that doesn't follow. It is wrong to give a child cancer for educational purposes. We don't make exceptions to that rule for parents who want to give their children cancer, and there is no non-arbitrary reason to make an exception for God. In conclusion, the free will theodicy does not provide a satisfactory response to premise P of the argument from evil. One can believe in it, of course, despite all the problems I've mentioned, but the intellectual price tag of doing so is, I submit, unacceptably high. If you like this video and want to help this channel grow, please hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. If you want to share your thoughts on the free will theodicy, or what your preferred response to the argument from evil is, leave a comment below. As a reminder, I do plan to cover all major theodicies as well as the skeptical theism response in this series. So until next time, thanks as always for watching. I'm David John Wellman, and the rest is up to you.